Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua. Today with us, we have a special guest, a young scholar, Cha-Jua Birchmier. She is a PhD candidate in community psychology at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. She holds a master's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois and a Bachelor of Arts from Washington University in St. Louis. Her dissertation, and that's what we're here to discuss largely, it explores the Ferguson Uprising, focusing on the interconnections and disconnects between the labor movement, specifically the Fight for 15, fast food workers organization, and the Black Liberation Movement in St. Louis, Missouri. As a community psychologist, Ms. Birchmier foregrounds individual and collective agency within micro and macro ecological systems. Her project approached ecological analysis novelly by studying multi-level processes and relationships in order to recontextualize the development of the Fight for 15 and the Ferguson Uprising within local political economic conditions and the global transition to low-wage service sector labor without sacrificing the macro or the micro. Chelsea, pleasure to see you.
It's great to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. Now, Chelsea, this is your first time on Real Talk, and we try to be informal, so it's first names, brother, sister, comrade, comrade with the D. We will eliminate the E. That's an activity of incarcerated prisoners of war and political prisoners in that regard. So we honor that tradition. Now, as you know, I'm a devotee of Bill Cross's negrescence theory. And as we can see, that wouldn't be the appropriate lens to approach you. But a former colleague of Cross's, Janet Helms, very significant African American psychologist, she took Cross's basic framework, which is developed from insights that you'll find in The Wretched of the Earth, Chapter 4, Frantz Fanon. And she created a framework that allows us to think in terms of white racial identity. And so now I'm going to share screen of that. Yeah. Okay. Now, let me see if I can make this bigger. Okay, good. So what I'd like you to do is kind of talk about where you were born and raised and describe your social historical experiences, how growing up in Kansas City and then moving to St. Louis in terms of your college experience and your family's ethnicity and class background, the time period of your formative years, and how that helped to politicize you in terms of your concerns about labor and Black liberation and human liberation. And if you can, point to some things in terms of the Helms model, if you would.
Yeah, of course. Thank you again for the introduction and having me on your show. It's great to be on this side. I've watched some of your episodes. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, as you mentioned, in the suburbs of Kansas City, so north of the Mississippi River. My grandparents on my mother's side are second generation immigrants, Polish, Catholic, and Russian Jewish immigrants, and then French second generation immigrants on my father's side. My family, growing up, I was part of like what you would call the technical or professional managerial class, and then later more oriented toward the petite bourgeoisie class of small business owners. Growing up, my dad was a manager for a recycling company, and my mom was a social worker. She also did some scattered retail work as well as work in the household. And then when I was a teenager, my father started his own recycling company. So just a little bit of an interesting fact we're going to discuss later. I'm a labor activist. And when my father was the manager of a recycling company, he was actually on the other side of labor negotiations. So he was negotiating with the union on behalf of the company. So it's just funny to think about how the tables have turned now that I have negotiated on the union side. And then my family's pretty highly educated. My parents both have bachelor degrees. And then my grandparents on my mother's side also got their PhDs because they were professors of sociology and philosophy. And then my grandfather on my father's side had a bachelor's degree. He was a farmer, and he also worked as a soil conservationist for the government. And then my grandmother on my father's side didn't have a bachelor's degree. She mostly did clerical, retail, and some work in the household as well. And I really appreciate you bringing up Dr. Helm's white racial identity model and how it's shaped by some of Fanon's writings. And I think that really helped me kind of identify my experiences. It was very accurate for me. So kind of walking through the phases. In the phase one, which is like the abandonment of racism phase, I grew up in a majority white neighborhood and school. And so most of the critical incidents I remember were in high school or in early college. But the very first stage of that first phase, which is contact, I think happened pretty early for me because I grew up in a multiracial family on my mother's side. My cousins and my aunts were Black and Polish. And this is like this side of my family that lived in Detroit, and we would have family reunions every year. And so I was very young, and I only learned some of this later on. But my, extended family would tell my parents that you have to talk to your daughters about race because they have Black cousins. And, we were asking questions and making comments that made it clear that no one had really talked to us about race. So I think that phase and Dr. Helm's model of contact kind of happened around that time. And so I think as I was growing up, before I got to high school, I kind of, wavered between the following phases because I had those experiences with my Black family members and they would talk about their experiences with racism. But I was also receiving, conflicting messages from school, from the media. So I had a social studies teacher, for example, in elementary school who taught an explicitly pro-Confederate history of the Civil War. And so I was getting all of these different counter messages from these different sources. But having mentors especially on my mom's side of the family kind of helped me move through those stages in phase one. My grandmother on my mother's side who helped raise me, like I said, she was a sociology professor. And she was socialist leaning. Her brother, my great uncle, was a tool and die maker in General Motors in Flint, Michigan. And he was part of the United Auto Workers. And then her sister, my great aunt, was a union steward for the nurses union in Detroit. So I got some counter messages there that were counterposed to those dominant ones. And they helped shape my beliefs about race and class. But I don't think I really moved to phase two, which is defining a non-racist white identity, until I got to high school. And this was really memorable for me. I was a high school student journalist. And so I ended up attending an emergency meeting when the Kansas City public school system lost its accreditation. And that was my first time witnessing Black Kansas Cityans organizing to try to save their school district from getting taken over by the state of Missouri and getting privatized. And for me, that really shifted my perspective. I kind of started to see oh, this is the power of community organization. And I wanted to help, but didn't know how. So at the time, I was just like, oh, I'll write about this in my student newspaper and raise awareness about this issue. So I think that's when my awareness of race really started to increase. And then around the same time, Occupy Wall Street was happening. And there was a branch in Kansas City called Occupy Kansas City. So as a student journalist, I was interviewing some of the people that participated in that. And so then my awareness of class also started to shift. And then I think I moved through like the later phases of the model once I got to undergrad in St. Louis. So 12 years ago, I was in my sophomore year at Washington University in St. Louis, and the Ferguson Uprising started. And so I think for me and for a lot of people, that was a huge moment, especially for people that were in St. Louis at that time. It was kind of like a time when you had to choose sides. And so I started reading a lot. I started getting involved in activism. And I met a lot of people that kind of helped walk me through what was happening and like get more involved in organizing. And so I had a really close friend from Pakistan, and I took a South Asian history class with her. The class was taught by Professor Shafali Chandra, so that kind of added a global dimension. I think that's when I read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth for the first time, learned about imperialism. And through some of those connections I met another student named Danielle, and she was mentored by professor, scholar, activist Jonathan Fenderson, who's was part of the Organization for Black Struggle at the time. And Danielle helped recruit me to revive an organization called the Student Worker Alliance. And that's what I really identify as the start of my labor activism, and also what like helped me bring me to that final stage of the model and move towards action.
Okay, great. So any other key readings other than Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth?
I trying to remember. I read a lot in undergrad, but I think in high school, the key readings that I remember, funnily enough, were existentialist and absurdist literature. I read Sartre and Camus. I think those kind of sparked me, like at least thinking critically or like questioning more of what I was seeing. Not really developing a firm analysis of, capital or anything like that. And then when I got to undergrad, that's when I started reading more explicitly like leftist and Marxist literature. So I definitely read the Communist Manifesto, Wretched of the Earth. Trying to think of anything else. I read Lenin's State and Revolution. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're a labor activist.
Mm-hmm.
And in at least two distinct moments in your life, you've been on the front lines of labor struggles. So can you describe both engagements? But when you move to the second moment of your praxis, I want you to talk about lessons learned from your first moment of engagement that you were able to apply to your second moment of labor activism. And also, I want you to explore some insights in an article that you wrote about that second moment of activism entitled Toward Abolitionist Unionism, Resisting Pandemics, Police, and Academic Austerity at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Yeah. So like I was just mentioning, I first joined the Student Worker Alliance. There were some students who wanted to revive it. It had been an organization in 2005 that had occupied the Washington University in St. Louis campus and won living wage increases for all the workers on campus. So we thought that was really cool, and we wanted to, try to rebuild an organization like that. And so what we started doing was supporting adjunct faculty at WashU. We helped them unionize and then win their first contract. Then we also helped food service workers on campus unionize and supported a campaign by janitors. And while we were doing all of this, we were getting trainings from the Service Employees International Union. They taught us how to have organizing conversations with workers and get membership cards signed. And we also did some, actions where we would disrupt the chancellor and at the Day of Diversity and Dialogue to draw attention to the disconnect of how he was exploiting Black workers, but then holding this Day of Diversity and Dialogue. So we tried to just really build solidarity with students and workers on campus. And then as we were doing that, we also wanted to build solidarity with labor movements across St. Louis. And that's how I got connected with the Fight for 15 movement of fast food workers who were trying to win a union and a $15 minimum wage. They had just started working on that a couple years ago. And so they were really looking for building a lot of support behind them. And I got really active in that, and I became a student organizer for that campaign. So some of what we worked on there was we helped plan and participated in a civil disobedience action, blocking the street in front of McDonald's. It was like a bunch of McDonald's workers, clergy, students working on that. We organized some panels and teach-ins and political education with fast food worker leaders for students to learn what was happening there. And then we organized student walkouts, we wrote op-eds, made social media posts, all that kind of stuff to support workers.
So what of those skills did you take to when you came to the University of Illinois? And I know at some point you became president of the GEO, the Graduate Employees Union, so Graduate Employees Organization. Mm-hmm. And you talk about what you were able to take and bring to the labor struggles of graduate students at the University of Illinois.
Yeah, so I learned a lot of concrete skills about how to do labor organizing, because labor organizing works in very specific ways. I mean, there's a process to organizing conversation. It's very numbers driven. So all of those kind of skills, I think I gained. But I also think I learned some lessons that were kind of larger lessons that I brought with me. So this one is a little bit specific, but it always sticks with me because it was just a big learning moment. When the Student Worker Alliance was planning a teach-in about local struggles for a living wage, I remember we had this community labor organizer in St. Louis named Christian Blackman come to help us with the teach-in. And she asked us why we didn't have any of the janitors coming to speak, even though we had originally said, we want to bring in the janitors to talk about the struggles that they're doing. And then we're like, oh, well, it's scheduled during dinner time. And we heard they just got off their shift. So we don't want to make them come, do this extra work. And she was like, you can never make that decision for the workers. You have to always let them make that decision for themselves. And I really see that connecting because I see people making those assumptions and mistakes all the time. And it's easy to do because you don't want to burden other people. But if you do that, you end up losing the power of those people could be potential leaders, really strong organizers, and you just disregarded them because you thought they didn't have time, or you thought, whatever you thought about them. And so go ahead.
Substitutionism, where you attempt to substitute yourself as a petty bourgeois for actual workers, right? In terms of decision making. Okay, so
exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect way to phrase it. Mm-hmm. And then another overarching lesson that I learned was about solidarity. And I think a lot of times solidarity is thought of as a transactional process or something that's separate or external to the labor movement. We're doing this so that we can get support during bargaining or, XYZ. But I think because I was in St. Louis during such a powerful moment of Black workers' struggle, I saw that what the fast food workers did for the Ferguson Uprising and what Ferguson did for the fast food workers movement was more than just the sum of the parts. When those movements came together, even briefly, it was very, very powerful. And things were changing so quickly. There were concrete improvements to working class people's lives in ways that you could never see if they were separate. And so I think I brought that with me into my own union organizing in GEO as well.
So once at Illinois, what type of labor organizing, what did the GEO do during your term?
Well, when I first got to University of Illinois, I came right after undergraduate. I did my master's in 2017. GEO went on strike in 2018. So right when I arrived, I went on strike. I had just gotten there, but I immediately became a steward for the psychology department. So I was trying to organize people in my department to go on strike. And after that strike, I feel like I just learned a lot very quickly because strikes are so intense, and there's a lot of education that you get being on the picket line and being on strike. But unfortunately, there was a lot of processes that happened after that kind of weakened the power of GEO a little bit. After we went on such a major strike, there was a Supreme Court decision called Janus versus AFSCME in 2018 that made paying dues optional, essentially, if you're not a member of the union. And then COVID hit in 2020, so a lot of institutional knowledge was lost during those processes. And that's right when I became co-president of the GEO in 2020 to 2021. And so my role was kind of trying to help guide the union through COVID-19. And that was around the time that the George Floyd police rebellion happened too. And so I really wanted to learn some of the lessons, bring some of the lessons that I had learned being in St. Louis during the Ferguson Uprising. And so we did a lot of work around that. We tried to organize some political education around the strike for Black lives. And I remember you had shared some resources with us regarding that. We got started on a lot of mutual aid related projects. And I think it was the following year that when I was the chair of GEO Solidarity Committee that we joined the Coalition for Progress and Liberation that started in Champaign-Urbana. And we engaged in a campaign to get the former police chief fired and removed from teaching at a local college. He had been responsible for a police killing of a Black teenager in Champaign in 2009. And he was hired by a college to teach, I think it was community policing or something.
Community policing. You must have been successful. We did get him fired.
Right. Right. Yeah, it was ridiculous. Around that time, we also engaged in a campaign called Defund UIPD, and that's what I wrote about in that article that you referenced. And that was a campaign to divest funding from police and reinvest that funding into resources for the community. And so when we wrote about this campaign in 2021, we argued that what we were calling abolitionist unionism was essential to achieving academic freedom and ultimately to achieving radical social change. But when I'm looking back now, I think the Defund UIPD campaign was only partially successful in the sense that we did do a lot of campaigning on the ground and organizing, but we only won a referendum to redirect, I think it was 25% of police funding into community resources. We won that student referendum, but we didn't have any power to force the university administration to actually implement it. We didn't have a lot of widespread support from other unions or other workers. And so I guess a critique I have now of the approach we took then was that our campaign, and I think this is true for a lot of police abolition-oriented work, we didn't focus enough on having a clear vision or strategy or tactics for the aspects that working classes tend to care the most about, which is the community resources part. So we had a very clear idea that 25% of the funding was going to come from the police, but we didn't have a clear idea about what community resources they were going to go to, how the community would have a say in those processes, or how we would engage people in that process. So I think that was a limitation of that approach then.
So you used the term abolitionist unionism. Can you define that for our audience?
Yeah, so what we meant by that was a form of union activism that is basically fighting for police and prison abolition.
Good. Now I want to switch to to a different type of intellectual discussion, one that's more about your ideas and your academic work than your activism. So in your dissertation, you're you mentioned that you're guided by dialectical materialism. Well, we know dialectical materialism to be a philosophy. And since your dissertation is highly historical, which is very unusual for a psychology student, highly historical, you're basically using an approach that we would call the materialist conception of history or historical materialism. So, explain how that methodology, how you apply it to your study of the Ferguson Uprising.
Yeah. I think the dialectical material or materialist conception of history as a methodology allows me to do a few things. So, first, I think it allows me to really systematically connect these bigger structural macrosystem processes to everyday microsystem experiences on a smaller scale or a local scale. And then it also guides me to reach backward into history and trace how the seeds of the Ferguson Uprising were planted before the Ferguson Uprising even occurred. So I'm not only looking at these larger transformations in capital, like neoliberalism, for example, or focusing narrowly on the events of the Ferguson Uprising itself, but I'm tracing how these political economic changes shaped the on the ground conditions in St. Louis in the decades preceding Ferguson and how they facilitated or constrained Black worker struggle. And then I think the last thing that a material conception of history helps me do is just cut through all of the different, noise, so to speak, all of these different elements. It helps me identify which processes and relations between which actors, organizations, coalitions with what ideologies and strategies, among many, were decisive in determining the direction of the Ferguson Uprising.
So let's talk about the Ferguson Uprising. Now, you, I've read at least 3 books on Ferguson and maybe 25 articles. You locate the movement action in a larger history that's grounded in the formation and the destruction of African American communities in St. Louis, and particularly in North St. Louis County. Can you first establish the political economy of St. Louis, St. Louis County, and can you talk about the racialized spatial configuration um, from, say, the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe in 1972? The destruction of that housing project is one of the events that, along with the economic processes that pushed Black people out of St. Louis City into North County. And while you do this, I'm going to put up a map. Well, no. You start doing it, and then later I'll put up a map of North St. Louis County so people can see just how politically fractured it is. All right, so go
Okay,
ahead.
that's perfect. I was thinking it would be helpful to have a map. Um, so just a critical moment of this history to start with that not a lot of people realize if they're not haven't lived in St. Louis, that St. Louis as a city is separate from the rest of St. Louis County, and this happened in 1876. The city of St. Louis permanently and officially split from the county. So just keep this in mind because it's very relevant to everything that ends up happening next. And then historically, just a little bit about the political economy of St. Louis. It was an industrial town, but not quite as major as like a Detroit, for example. But there was a lot of industry going on in St. Louis at its height. There was a little bit of confluence of northern and southern influences there. And it was also a transportation hub, which is why it was called the Gateway to the West. And the Black working class originally was concentrated in urban cores in the city of St. Louis. But I think because the city of St. Louis split from the county so early on, before, most cities would grow a lot in the time period between like the late 1800s to the mid 1900s.
Right.
But St. Louis City's growth was a little bit constricted. And so it experienced the flight of capital out of the city into St. Louis County very early on, like in the 1950s, when it should have been at its height. And this was really enabled by that geography.
When you say it experienced the flight of capital, what does that mean in real practical terms?
So a lot of the major businesses where people could get jobs moved out of the city of St. Louis into St. Louis County.
Okay. And this is literally a generation before what we will see happen in the late 1970s and 1980s when we see what some people call deindustrialization. But at least for Black folks, it's deproletarianization because it's the loss of not just private sector jobs, it's also the loss of public sector jobs.
Exactly. Yeah, because you drain a lot of the city's resources. So those public jobs go away too.
Okay.
So then shifting forward a little bit to closer to the period that I'm studying, in the 1970s, there are these major global macro system transformations and broader waves of neoliberal restructuring. And so those involve initially deproletarianization or job loss for Black folks, but also what I'm mostly focused on, subproletarianization, which is the process where living wage, stable union jobs transform into low wage, precarious part-time jobs. And with that, there comes a major expansion of the service sector economy. So jobs like fast food jobs.
And they're ununionized and no benefits, right?
Exactly. No benefits. A lot of people have to work multiple jobs because they don't pay enough to just work one job. And so in St. Louis, one of the major markers of this transition is the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe, which was the largest public housing complex in St. Louis, one of the largest in the U.S. And that was one of the key steps in the city of St. Louis's urban renewal process. And that really symbolized that transition from the post-war to the neoliberal era, like kind of like the final step in that process. And then another critical event that really marks this neoliberal restructuring and helps create the Ferguson that we see in 2010 is the dispossession of the Black community from the all-Black town of Kinloch so that the Lambert Airport in St. Louis can expand. And that is a big part of what pushed people out of Kinloch and the city of St. Louis into municipalities like Ferguson. And that's why their demographics shift so rapidly. So that's why Ferguson could be a sundown town in 1960 and then be 67% Black in 2010, just before the Ferguson Uprising.
So let me put up this map at this point. Okay. That didn't work. Share screen, Google Map. Okay. Now we go wide. All right, good. So here's the map, essentially of North St. Louis. Are you able to make anything out there? I can make this a bit larger, I think.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. All right. Will this help your explanation?
Yeah, I think so. I'll explain the North County a little bit, and then maybe we can zoom out just to show what the rest of St. Louis. So you can see the Mississippi River there. That's the boundary that's separating the city of St. Louis there from the county. So like the St. Louis city is to the east, and then the county is there to the west. And then so you see Ferguson. Ferguson is one of 90 different municipalities throughout St. Louis County. And then there's like 30 or so municipalities that are mostly in that northern St. Louis County area that are majority Black municipalities, and they range from small to mid-size. So Ferguson's population is about 21,000 people. And this is a mostly Black, mostly working class part of St. Louis, the North County is.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
push this little arrow onto some of the majority Black places.
Mhm.
I also have a list of some of these places. So I'll stop sharing here, and I'll go and share the list of some of these places. So we should now be able to see some names, right? Can you see?
Not yet. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Because within 5 miles of Ferguson are 10 majority Black communities, some with populations as high as 95%.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And most of those, like before the 1970s, were like nearly all white or just straight up all white sundown towns.
Yeah. They were sundown towns.
Yeah.
Ferguson was a sundown town
It
in the
was.
1950s and 60s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
And it was separated off from Kinloch, the all Black town that was bordering it. It was literally like partitioned off, and the only people that could get through Kinloch and Ferguson were like the domestic workers, the Black domestic workers working in the homes of the white communities in Ferguson.
When you say partition off, like I know there's a community in Detroit where there's a literal wall that was built separating the Black space from white space. Are you talking about that kind of real physical separation?
I believe it was like a chained off.
The chain fence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so that shoots large numbers of Black folk into North County, and we begin to see a transformation of those formerly all white sundown towns to Black majority communities.
Exactly. And so there are a lot more jobs, because of the capital flight we discussed earlier in St. Louis County. But and those jobs do exist in North St. Louis County too. So you have Emerson Electric in Ferguson, for example. You have Boeing in St. Louis County. You have some pharmaceutical companies. But by and large, Black workers are not able to access these jobs. And I'll talk a little bit more about why later. But Black workers are also, because they're concentrated in the north of St. Louis County, they're geographically and demographically isolated from kind of where the heart of St. Louis County's governance is, which is Clayton, which is in a part of St. Louis called Mid-County, just like literally in the middle of St. Louis County. And that's where the financial seat of St. Louis is. Sorry?
It's to the south, right? To the southwest of where Ferguson is.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. And then St. Louis County's government, its court, its law enforcement, all of this is located in Clayton, not in North County.
Or the city of St. Louis.
Right. So the city of St. Louis has its own government, its own court, and its own law enforcement. And then just something that's relevant for Ferguson too is, even though St. Louis County has its own government, court, and law enforcement, like so do many of those small municipalities. So Ferguson had its own police force, it had its own court, and it had its own government too. So there were, I think, like 60 some different police departments in all of those various small and mid-sized municipalities throughout St. Louis County, as well as the St. Louis County Police Force.
And so what that means that those 90 municipalities, a large number of them have their own police. Now, I was in the St. Louis area for 6 years. I lived in Hazelwood, which is part of the North County places. Mm-hmm. And you can get from Hazelwood to Ferguson in like 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. But driving through that corridor, I think I had to go through at least 3 majority Black towns to get from uh, Hazelwood to Ferguson, that's where the Popeyes was. Back when I ate very poorly, I'd go to. But you're running through all these different police, and they're always stopping you,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Hmm.
So black folks move into this area, and can you talk about the transformation once we now have what is in essence a community that's becoming majority black, as the case is with Ferguson and several others. What actually about 30 of those municipalities.
Hmm. Sorry, what was your question?
So the question is, can you talk about the significance of that rapid suburbanization of the region's black population? And this is a process that's national, right?
Right. Hmm.
Right, the pushing of black folks out of those inner city communities that we built as a consequence of the first great migration.
Right. Right. Hmm. Okay. So I guess starting with the St. Louis case, just to give people some numbers behind this. In 1980, only about 11% of St. Louis County, which again, that's where Ferguson is, population, only about 11% of the St. Louis County population was Black. But that number grew to about 23% by 2010. Um, and so the Black community did make up a majority of the city of St. Louis in 2010. But by that time, there had been so much population loss due to all of the factors we already discussed that there were only about 150 some thousand Black folks in the city, while over 230,000 lived in St. Louis County.
Mhm.
Where there in St. Louis County, they were not only a minority, but fragmented it into those, 30 or so Black municipalities, like Ferguson. And so, like you mentioned, this is happening nationally. And this means that there is a new Black working class to some extent that's being forged in the suburbs and the exurbs. I think, especially now, like that there are these massive warehouses in the outskirts of major cities. I think we're going to be paying a lot of attention to that and what that means for labor, Black labor there. And then I also think we have to understand what Harold Barron, who was the Chicago Urban League director of research in 1968, called the web of urban racism.
Mhm.
So I think we have to understand how that's shifted in the 21st century to what I'm now, adapting to call the web of suburban racism. Sorry,
Okay.
to analyze, how these suburban institutions have concentrated Black workers into low-wage jobs without access to public resources like education, housing, transportation, and so on. And also, I think what suburbanization means for Black political power and the ability to vote as a coherent bloc with all of this geographic fragmentation. And like, what's that doing to cities like St. Louis that are Black majority cities, but all of the power now lies in the county?
One of the things
Mhm.
that's interesting here is that this suburbanization process is northern and southern. And there's a map that came out in 2020, and it's a map that shows majority black towns and cities. And then there's another one that shows majority black counties. But the point I'm driving at is two big points. One, 20%, one in five, well, technically 19%, almost one in five, every black person lives in a majority black municipality, right?
Mm, mhm,
And if you look at them on a map, it looks very much like the map of the 1890s, 1930s Black Belt Nation that goes from Maryland to Texas in a crescent shape. This is literally being reconstructed at this
mhm,
moment. And the situation you're talking about around Ferguson is one of those spaces
mhm.
where we can see that that configuration, that reconfiguration.
Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, Ferguson is a perfect example of that. Hmm.
So let's get to Ferguson. So the places around Ferguson, Blackjack, Dalewood, Jennings, they are, and you used an internal colonial analysis of this. They're what we could call neo-colonies, meaning that they're they're ruled by black folk, a comprador class. Why is Ferguson a more classic colony in which a white minority rules a black majority? And I know in the dissertation you list governmental offices and who occupies them. So can you kind of situate that?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm arguing in my dissertation that Ferguson does represent one of these more classical cases of internal colonialism. It really maps onto the what Fanon calls like this compartmentalized colonial world and or a world divided in two in the Wretched of the Earth. And so yeah, sorry.
Manichaeanism.
Exactly. Yeah, Manichaeanism. Uh, and yeah, this was a nearly all white leadership. I mean, someone gave me feedback once on my writing and said, well, maybe you should just say who's not white because it's almost everyone. The mayor was white. 5 out of 6 of the city council was white. The city council appointed the city clerk and the city manager who was white. And Ferguson was a city manager oriented system. And so then the city manager then appoints a bunch of people who are running the municipal court system and the police chief. And all of those people were white too. And then, of course, the police chief oversees the police force, which was made up of 50 out of 54 white officers. And Ferguson was 67% black. So it's just a pretty stark case of a majority black city, municipality, I guess, being run by an all-white leadership. And then we started talking about this a little bit, but what the uprising really exposed is how Ferguson's white leadership funded their municipality using these really excessive fines and fees aimed at their black community. And those fines and fees came from different sources. Some were outdated, that were just kind of copy and pasted from the state of Missouri statutes. And they were only enforced once the demographics of St. Louis started to shift. So they weren't applied to the Ferguson's white community ever until black people started arriving in Ferguson. So one example of that would be manner of walking along roadway. You know, no one was ever fined for not walking on the sidewalk, especially in places where sidewalks were inaccessible, until black community members started not walking on sidewalks. And then there were also some that were unique and were clearly just developed by Ferguson's leadership to extract more fines specifically from their black communities. So like one of those was in 2009, they banned community gardens, for example. They were just like very hyper-specific examples like that.
They banned community gardens.
Yeah, they had a lot. Right, yeah. Yeah, just so wild codes like that. And so a lot of has been exposed since the Ferguson Uprising about those fines and fees. And what I'm trying to add to the conversation using the internal colonial framework is to really highlight the labor aspect, because what I'm arguing is that Black workers' disproportionate relegation to these low-wage, sub-proletarian jobs was a form of super exploitation, and that's what maintained Ferguson as an internal colony. And I looked into some of the data, and about a third of Ferguson's Black workers were employed in these low-wage service jobs, like McDonald's jobs. And so the fines and fees really served as, and I borrow your term, the racial tax that reinforced super exploitation and kept Black workers in those low-wage jobs, all as part of that web of suburban racism.
And this is in a community that has Emerson Electric, which is one of the largest international capitalist, transnational capitalist firms in the world.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But Black folks aren't being hired for Emerson Electric.
Nope. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I want to throw this might be a somewhat difficult question, but there's been a revival of the caste thesis, right? A book entitled Caste won a major American book award. And so my question to you is this: why do you believe that the internal neocolonial thesis or the internal colonial thesis better explains Black folks' condition and situation in Ferguson than does the caste theory or this very sloppy notion called second class citizenship?
Yeah, so I think both of those concepts, both the caste thesis and second class citizenship, somewhat obscure rather than clarify some of the historically specific roots of the problem we're analyzing. So I haven't studied caste in depth, but my understanding of caste is that it refers to like a more fixed position in a hierarchy. And so I think that makes it hard to then be able to explain any sort of dynamic processes that are occurring. So, for example, if you wanted to understand how does internal colonialism transform into internal neocolonialism, that would be very hard to explain using caste. And second class citizenship, it seems to really just focus on inequality under the law, which only addresses one really small piece of the puzzle. And then I think neither of those concepts can adequately address the labor question in Ferguson because neither of them locate, exploitation or super exploitation as the heart of the analysis.
Okay. Brilliant answer. Okay, so now let's get to the heart of your work. I've read, as I said, 3 or 4 books on Ferguson, some written by radicals, and 20-something articles. In the description of what happened in terms of the Ferguson Uprising, they never mention any of the actors that you argue initiated and launched the Ferguson struggle. You describe a group of Fight for 15 labor activists who were young, black, and mostly black women who launched the Ferguson Uprising. What evidence you have for that thesis?
So I've used a lot of different sources. I did oral history interviews with those fast food workers, as well as leaders from Black liberation organizations, labor union activists, community organizers, participants in the Ferguson Uprising. So I did those interviews, but not just those interviews. I'm also using newspapers, dating back before my period, several decades back, and including the Ferguson Uprising. And after the Ferguson Uprising, I'm using social media. I've done some participant observation with the Fight for 15, a couple years before that movement ended. And I've gone to the archives. I've viewed the St. Louis Labor Council archives. There's a lot of archives in St. Louis related to Ferguson specifically. And then I've traced some of the cultural history. So like looked into the signs, songs, clothing, all of that. And so I think I've been able to bring all of that evidence together and really identify the fast food workers as being some of the key leaders. But a lot of the scholarship and media about the uprising either doesn't include them at all or kind of relegates them to like minor roles within the uprising. They form their own organization in addition to the Fight for 15 movement during the Ferguson Uprising that was called the Freedom Fighters. And that organization was very intergenerational in terms of collaborating with, longer standing organizations like the Organization for Black Struggle. But it also collaborated with a lot of the new youth organizations that were popping up during the Ferguson Uprising, like the Lost Voices. Sorry?
Like the Million Hoodies movement?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So can you just tell us your narrative of after Michael Brown is murdered, how the uprising is built and organized, who comes in to Ferguson and begins to organize and where. So what's your story in that regard?
Yeah, so from the story that I've put together so far, you of course have the Ferguson residents who live in the Canfield Green apartments. You have the family and extended family members of Michael Brown. Um, and then you have the fast food workers. So one of the workers that I interviewed, her name is Janina Jenkins, and she was working at the Ferguson McDonald's at the time that there was the police killing of Michael Brown, and she heard the gunshots while she was at work, so around noon at work. And one of the Fight for 15 organizers came and picked her up when she was off her shift and picked up her coworker as well, and they went straight to the front lines of the Ferguson Uprising. So they were already there in Ferguson because they were working at that McDonald's. So they were able to respond really quickly. And then you have some of these more longstanding organizations as well. So I mentioned the Organization for Black Struggle, which goes back to the 1980s. You have the Universal African Peoples Organization. One of the leaders of that, who I interviewed, Zaki Barudi, he had lived in the Ferguson Canfield Green apartments. So he was very familiar and very close to Michael Brown's family in the community there. You have the NAACP coming in at some point. So I think you have a lot of these long-standing organizations coming in, but very first is like the Ferguson residents, Mike Brown's family, and the fast food workers who are in the area.
So did they bring in fast food? Was it just the fast food workers from the Ferguson McDonald's, or did fast food workers as an organized entity come in from other parts of St. Louis County? And what
Uh,
specifically did they do?
so they came from different parts of St. Louis because something I've noticed is like they change jobs a lot. So there was like really tightly formed networks of people that maybe worked at the Ferguson McDonald's at one point or worked at the same place at one point, but they worked somewhere else by the time that the Ferguson uprising happened. So it was fast food workers from multiple locations, kind of sharing the news along their networks and coming together. So like in particular, there was like a network of mostly Black women activists that some of them worked at the Ferguson McDonald's, but they also worked throughout St. Louis that all got together and they formed that organization I mentioned, the Freedom Fighters. And so a lot of the work that they were doing, they were helping out on the ground, kind of, everyday tactics, getting food, what's going to happen this day, what's going to happen that day. But they were also doing a lot of behind the scenes strategizing. And so from what I've heard, they were meeting in a couple of different places. They were meeting in a church in Ferguson, and then they were also meeting in the Service Employees International Union headquarters once the coalition started growing a lot. And they were
Coalition.
It was called the Don't Shoot Coalition,
Okay,
and it
and
was
who?
made up of like 80 organizations.
Okay, and who are some of those organizations?
You have the Organization for Black Struggle. You have the union, labor union, so the Service Employees International Union and the Fight for 15. You have some of the newer organizations getting involved in that later too. And so I think I think it was the Lost Voices organization, Tribe X, from what I've heard. I think the Millennial Activists United were part of that too. Missourians Organized for Reform and Empowerment, who, along with OBS, were coordinating resources for the bail fund. Yeah, it was a lot of wide-ranging organizations involved in there, especially by October when they start organizing the big Ferguson October events.
There's a couple of things I find interesting about your narrative. There's an organization that has generally been seen as the mover and the shaker of the Ferguson Uprising. You haven't mentioned their name. You haven't said Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Okay. Well, it's right. Why not?
So the reason I didn't mention Black Lives Matter is because they, as far as I've understood, and I'm still piecing together the narrative, but they weren't as much a part of that coalition that was strategizing behind the scenes. They were more so on the ground talking to some of the young activists. Some have described it as maybe spreading a certain brand of activism on the ground, but being less involved in the behind the scenes strategizing work. And a lot of the Black Lives Matter activists ended up in Ferguson because of something called the Ferguson Freedom Rides. And they had a lot of previous connections among those activists who came together on the Freedom Rides because they had been part of an organization called BOLD. And I'm forgetting exactly what it stands for, but it was something
Oh,
related to Black organizing. Yeah.
BOLD.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Which I would describe as a very nonprofit oriented consultant, I guess, esque approach to activism.
Okay. Okay. Um, having lived in the area and been a member of, actually part of the leadership of an organization of Black struggle, one would, think in the St. Louis area, Organization Black Struggle, Universal African Peoples Organization were the major militant groupings. And you would think that if Jamala Rogers is involved, she will dominate and be the main strategist. So this notion that these young fast food workers play the critical role, I need you to give me a little bit more for me to see their essential role in this struggle.
Mm-hmm. Um, I think they were doing a lot of political education oriented activities. So they mentioned doing a few film screenings, reading group type situations. They formed a like women's committee where they were talking about the struggles of Black workers, whether that is related to police killings or related to wages. They helped craft some of the demands that were going into the Ferguson Uprising. I think they, spoke at some of the press conferences, and then some of them got hired on like by different organizations involved in the Ferguson Uprising. So Janina Jenkins, who I mentioned, she got hired by Fight for 15 in part because of her Ferguson activism, and then another worker I interviewed, Ebony Williams, was hired by the Organization for Black Struggle, and she was part of the effort to try to use the Ferguson Uprising to build a Black Worker Center, which ultimately doesn't end up happening. But she was sent to I think it was like a conference or a convention to discuss how to build a Black Worker Center in your area.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you also talk about this poet that was part of the fight. So he was a worker poet.
Mm-hmm.
So who is this, and can you tell us what he's done and maybe do a little bit of culture in terms of some of his poetry?
Yeah, so his name was Skillet, and he produced some of the music for the Fight for 15 movement, and he would go perform that at various events. And so one of the songs that he made was called Show Me 15, and it's a really good song. I included in one of my chapters.
Yeah.
And he kind of connects some of the concrete workers' issues to some of the issues that specifically Black workers were facing. For example, like mass incarceration. And I think from what I've seen, it was really a way to build up the culture of a movement in a way that made people want to be part of that movement and participate in it and get excited about it. And I think that was something that the Fight for 15 movement did really well, was really provide efforts for provide the space for the workers to create their own culture. Like they would have workers come up with their own chants or come up with their own songs and then use that as a way to bring people into the movement. And one really cool example I found of this was when Skillet was performing his song. I can't remember if it was in 2014 or 2013, but it was a cool series of connections that happened there. It was for the second birthday party of this organization for young activists in St. Louis. And the president of that organization was Rasheen Aldridge, who was a fast food worker who was very active in Fight for 15 and then went on to become a leader of the Ferguson Uprising as well. So he was hosting this birthday party for the organization, and he invited Skillet to come perform. It was in an art space called Blank Space. So Skillet performed, and then Tef Poe, who was also an activist who was very involved in the Ferguson Uprising, also performed. So you can kind of see that some of these connections were built prior to the Ferguson Uprising. And when the uprising happens, people are very quickly able to show up because they have these pre-existing networks.
Good. So I want to raise the question about social movement activism. And, we know that movements struggle to transform societies, right? Local, national, regional, and global. But there's an area of social movement research that those people are more bent toward the psychological aspects, such as yourself, look at how the activists themselves are transformed by their praxis. So, who and what types of personal transformations did the Fight for 15 young, mostly Black women labor activists, transformations did they go through in the process of the movement? And I think we need to point out that Ferguson, that struggle lasted more than a year. I think it's the second longest actual campaign after the Montgomery bus boycott.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't started writing this chapter yet, so I'm just going to share my preliminary thoughts, and I'll see what people think. So some of the theoretical frameworks that I'm drawing from here, Frantz Fanon in A Dying Colonialism is one of the people that put forward that thesis about how people transform at the same time that they change the world. And then there's this really interesting article by Toni Cade Bambara, where she describes how Black men and women fashion new identities and relationships through their participation in the Black liberation movement in the late 1960s. And she described it as they faced the task of creating a new identity via commitment to the struggle. And so I'm trying to look at how this transformation specifically happened for Black workers, and especially as they're undergoing subproletarianization, because that process is a huge part of it is dehumanization. I think one of the major transformations that I've identified as a through line of a lot of the interviews that I've had is that struggle was a humanizing force for them. So they realized through their collective struggle that they're not powerless, and that they have a voice on the job, which counters the marginalization and devaluation of Black labor, especially Black women's labor. And this goes with Fanon's, idea that social movements are the, quote, oxygen which creates and shapes a new humanity. So the way that one of my interlocutors, Janina Jenkins, described it was that Black working classes, quote, needed a voice in their own neighborhoods. So she was making the connection with how she got involved in Fight for 15 because she needed a voice on the job. And she was connecting that to the powerlessness that Ferguson residents felt that led them to spark a rebellion to get a voice in their own neighborhoods. And not only a voice regarding policing, but on things like jobs, schools, and housing. And then another quote from her that I wanted to share, she said, quote, "Mike Brown woke up the world. For a community and people to have a voice and to stand up no matter the consequences of it, no matter what happens next, as long as you fought and you stood strong, that's what matters." And then one more theme in terms of transformation that I've identified across interviews is really developing a sense of pride and confidence. And so Jenkins described this as she became, quote, proud to be Black, to understand my roots and understand that I'm just as important as anybody else. So that also points to the humanization element as well. And it was really, I think people really connected it to like their experiences with their families as well. So I asked people in the interviews, like, did this change your relationship with your families at all? Because, sometimes family relations can, become tense. But I think a lot of the people that I talked to had really positive experiences of, their relationships becoming even closer with their families in these social movement situations. So, when she became a leader in the Ferguson Uprising, her mom said, "Oh, I always knew my daughter was born to be a leader." And then when she became a parent, her experience as a parent and her relationship to her kids changed too, because she said, quote, "With my kids for bedtime, it's almost like I'm telling them a story, like a book from Fight for 15 and from Ferguson." And that it taught her that, quote, "No matter where you work at, you have to keep fighting. Anywhere you work, you can organize and you can educate and you can stand up for people." So she was saying, like, in her job now, she continues to organize, and that's something that always stays with her, no matter, if she's not, part of Fight for 15 anymore, or the Ferguson Uprising ended, but she continues to organize where she's at.
That's a wonderful story. Wonderful story. So I've got two final questions, and then we'll go to we'll go to the chat and see if there are questions. So these questions are interrelated. The first is more theoretical, or perhaps more historically grounded, in that, why do you think there's been more alienation than collaboration between the Black liberation movement and the labor movement?
Okay. So I think historically there's a couple of reasons. One just being the political economy and how class relations are fragmented and divided by race at every level of abstraction, from labor markets to residential spaces to schools and so on. And so with this and the concrete class configurations in the U.S., I'm thinking about how white workers have often leaned on the symbolic and material advantages of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the public and psychological wage. So that meant that even if white workers earn lower wages, they got the material benefits and the psychological benefits that came with that, of having better schools, quality housing, and access to political power and police forces, a voice.
And a slightly better wage.
Right, slightly better wage too. Yeah, that's true. Still low, but higher than Black workers' wages. And then white workers have preserved those short-term or marginal material advances by keeping Black labor out of unions or within marginal positions without access to union leadership within unions. And there's been many moments throughout history where unions have betrayed Black workers to some extent by supporting, regressive legislation or supporting the subjugation of Black labor in many cases. And then I think the second aspect is the absence of an organization that could coalesce labor and Black liberation movements. And so, thinking through, especially in more recent history, in the 1970s, you have the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Revolutionary Union movement. And then in St. Louis, there was the Action St. Louis, which Clarence Lang argued served as a bridge between the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement locally. And it also connected labor and Black liberation struggles with a focus on Black worker self-organization. So, for example, I interviewed Percy Green from Action St. Louis, and one of his most famous actions was climbing the St. Louis Arch to fight for Black construction jobs. And they organized very proactively for Black workers instead of, reactively when, a major incident occurs, for example. And then related to this, I think this is something that Professor Lou Turner here at U of I has argued, that part of the restructuring of capital that destroyed living wage union jobs and subproletarianized Black workers in the auto plants was also a form of capital disciplining, workers who went on wildcat strikes in Detroit. So I think this left a vacuum and left few examples for organizations to model, what, for example, the Revolutionary Union movement was doing. But I think in St. Louis, there was a little bit more continuity than, say, in Detroit, because you still have those leaders like Percy Green, who there was an event where he literally handed a torch to some of the young activists from Fight for 15 and said, "We're passing on the struggle to you." So there was a little bit of continuity there. And then,
Yes.
go ahead.
Well, there's certainly continuity between Percy Green and his action work and Jamala Rogers
Right.
and the Organization for Black Struggle in the form of marriage.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so all of that definitely facilitated the intergenerational collaboration.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
I was just going to talk a little bit about the state of the relationship of labor and Black liberation movements in St. Louis in the period that I'm studying. So, because it's a little bit, I think, different than historically. And this is what I've really been trying to work through in my research, because you do still have Black exclusion from some unions. It might not be as explicit, it might be de facto, but Black workers are still excluded from construction trades, for example. And this leads to some conflict in St. Louis, like in the 1990s, over diversifying jobs and contracts on highway construction. And then you still have unions that are majority Black membership, but have white leadership. And there's one incident that's like kind of famous in St. Louis where the transit union was mostly Black workers. They had a white union president. They were negotiating, and the lead negotiators of the transit company handed out recipes for an Oreo cookie, which is extremely petty, to imply that the membership is Black and the leadership is white. But I think these only can get to some extent of the issue with the lack of collaboration between labor and Black liberation movements in my period. I think one of the best books that has helped me understand is called Solidarity Divided by labor activists Bill Fletcher Jr. and Fernando Gapacine. That it's not just a leadership issue in unions. So replacing leadership isn't going to necessarily address the deeper rooted issues. It can certainly help, but a deeper transformation of union culture is necessary. And I have unfortunately experienced this firsthand, being part of the local AFL-CIO Central Labor Council. I'm a trustee, and the traditional trade union culture is extremely white and extremely male. And there's certain traditions and practices that are nearly impossible to change. Like, you start the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. There's, I don't know how many different golf fundraisers that are the main source of where our money is going. And then if you want to raise an alternative idea, like, people just can raise their hand and say, table that idea. It's all very ingrained into the culture. And that is very hard to change.
Okay. So based on the Ferguson Uprising and seeing alliances, coalitions, united fronts created that were either led by our Black Fight for 15 activists, strongly participated in, seeing them forge with new and older activists, does that give you a greater sense of hope that we're beginning to see a new relationship between the Black Liberation Movement and the labor movement? Do you see the possibility of the kind of transformation that people like Percy Green and the people who led the League dreamed of?
I definitely do see hope, and I see a lot of possibility. And I think that's part of why I wanted to pursue this research. And I think there is something unique about the intergenerational relationships and struggles that were being forged between those fast food workers and, the Organization for Black Struggle and people like Percy Green from Action St. Louis. So I think the fact that the fast food workers formed their own organization during the Ferguson Uprising called the Freedom Fighters, and they were at the forefront of that struggle, was very promising. I think the relationships they formed with a lot of other young working class people was promising. And I think there was a lot of possibility in them getting hired on to organizations like Organization for Black Struggle and Fight for 15. And you could see the effects of their work on the movement. Like, I think the labor movement did shift because of their actions. I mean, when the Fight for 15 started, they took an essentially colorblind approach to the issue of low-wage workers' struggles. Like, they would just let the fact the workers are Black speak for itself. And that shifts a lot after the Ferguson Uprising. They become much more conscious about actually speaking about race and racism. And then you also see a lot of, resolutions getting passed, attempts to like create new curricula within these larger bodies like the AFL-CIO, the larger Federation of Labor. And so all of that happens because of the fast food workers. And like I mentioned earlier, like when these struggles came together, I think it really accelerated some of the changes in St. Louis to conditions, like winning a wage increase the year after the Ferguson Uprising, which was taken away by the state of Missouri, but they won it. But ultimately, I think the labor and Black liberation movements and their associated organizations kind of restabilized and retrenched after Ferguson. So those changes weren't as long lasting as I would have hoped. Fast food workers didn't maintain any new organizational form after Ferguson. They remained within Fight for 15, and they had to work within the confines of the Service Employees International Union, which it did have greater representation of Black union members and leaders than many other unions. And they did start to put forward that more race and gender and somewhat more militant messaging. But they're still a business union at the end of the day. And that's how most major unions operate in the United States. And I think that's kind of like part of the heart of the problem is when I first started this project, I was thinking of it in the sense that there's a racism problem within the labor movement and there's a class problem within the Black liberation movement, but it's not quite right. It's, partially true. But the more that I've learned about these movements, and especially going to the archives of the St. Louis AFL-CIO, what I realized is that both the Black liberation movement and the labor movement have shifted toward their own separate brands of like more professional managerial class or corporate style politics. And this leaves very few opportunities for genuine organizations for the working class and even fewer for the Black working class. So the question, then suggests a need for a revitalization or rebirth of both the labor and the Black liberation movements. And not as a synthesis necessarily of two separate movements, but whether the fast food workers movement could organically unite struggles of race and labor and what that signals for new organizational forms of resistance that are to come. So that's what I'm grappling with as I'm finishing writing my dissertation.
Thank you, Chelsea. That was very insightful, and based on what we've seen in terms of the scholarship, I think this work, once you turn it into a book, will make a phenomenal contribution. So I'm going to go to comments, and while I'm searching through comments to see what people say, do you have any summatory comments or any announcements that you'd like to make?
Thank you again for having me on. I just want to give a note that I haven't finished my dissertation yet. I'm very much still writing it. So I do appreciate any suggestions, thoughts, or reading recommendations. There is a great new book out about Ferguson called A People's History of Ferguson by Stefan Bradley. So I want to give that a shout out. And then I also want to thank you, Professor Cha-Jua, because I wouldn't be doing this research if I hadn't taken your class and you hadn't helped guide me throughout the dissertation process. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And that brings us to a question here. People listening to the conversation, they're somewhat confused as to what's your discipline.
That is a common confusion.
Yeah. Bring clarity to that question.
So I'm in a sub-discipline of psychology called community psychology. which is approaching psychology from a different perspective than the field typically does. So instead of trying to look at individuals and understand why individuals are not doing well within the current conditions, it shifts more to look at those conditions themselves and how communities can change those conditions. And so it is a field that is more oriented towards the study of social movements, but I am also bringing a very interdisciplinary approach to the field by bringing in a historical approach. So I am using some community psychology theories and methods, but I think by and large it is a project of history, maybe sociology, and a few other interdisciplinary fields as well.
As I look through, there's a lot of positive comments, but not as many questions. There's observations. So I'll read one observation from two corners. The chemical refineries systematically poisoning Black and brown communities are critical for supplying the imperial machinery. Same thing with the refinery in Garden Grove. Does that speak at all to any of the work that you're doing? Anything there for you to respond to?
I'll look into the Garden Grove. I hadn't come across that yet, but I think the poisoning aspect is definitely resonating, because in St. Louis there was a lot of struggles around the West Lake. I think it was called the West Lake landfill.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's something that definitely came up when I'm looking at the period before the Ferguson Uprising, and it was also ongoing during the uprising. So some people were kind of getting involved in that too. So that's a good point to look into that more.
Someone by the name of Gildy Bridges points out that RAM co-founder Donald Freeman, who someone I was speaking to just last week, was pointing out to me that he's got a number of writings, including a book, and has gotten very little recognition. But the point is that he conceived of a concept called suburban colonialism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we might want to follow that up.
Yeah, thank you so much for the recommendation. That sounds very relevant.
And I'll run down, Stephanie Sewell.
Oh,
That's
yes.
who was talking to me about Don Freeman and his papers and a book that he published maybe a couple years ago.
Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah. People say great work and pointing out the working class nature of the uprising from David Steelberg. Good Girl Obey says that she was a part of the struggle. Thanks for the shout out. A correct assault on D. Ray McKeeson. We'll just leave it at that. Okay. My producer Henry is smiling because he literally loses it when I run over 90 minutes. He's really offended by my lack of discipline sometimes. As it turns out, we're going to be able to end this conversation in exactly 90 minutes.
Wow, great timing.
And, all right, so I am looking forward to another chapter of the dissertation and the completion. And as I said, I've read a lot of the books, and you seem to have gotten a more interior view from the activists, as well as a use of the archives despite other books being written by historians, they didn't go to the archives on this question, and you have. So I think it's going to be phenomenal work. And again, you can tell when you're reading a book or an article by someone who is simply an academic and someone who has an activist background, because there's insights. There are things that someone like you will see that someone who has never been engaged in struggle simply can't, it's not in their bandwidth. So again, thank you for the work that you are doing, Chelsea. And it's time for me to bring this to an end. So
thank you so much again for having me, and thank you, everyone.
So let me remove you.
Black Liberation Media is a collective of Black and African organizers, journalists, academics, and media personalities serving Black and African masses seeking to further grow in their understanding of themselves, their histories, and the African world through entertainment and news. Please continue to like, subscribe, and donate to the channel so we can further serve you and liberate our people. You can also go to blkliberationmedia.org, get some merchandise, and also become a Patreon member and a member from the YouTube. Please do what you can, share, and show your love as we will show ours for you. Black Liberation Media.